Anytime I'm traveling overseas, when I'm packing, I always have this conversation with my wife, Jen. I always say, I want to pack stuff so that I fit in, so that people look at me and they think I'm a native. And she always tells me, you're not. You're an American. Just embrace it. You're a tourist. Everyone's going to know. But I'm convinced that's not true. And years ago, I was going to Morocco, and my friend Chip was coming along, and I was talking to him on the phone a couple days before we left, and I told him I grew a beard so I'd fit in. And he told me, he said, listen, everywhere you go, you stick out like a sore thumb. He's like, the only place I could possibly go with you where you wouldn't stick out is like Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands. Other than that, everyone knows you're an American. So as I was traveling this summer, I tried to fit in, but nobody mistook me for a Korean. But here's the thing. Here's the thing about it. Like, when you know you don't belong, you always have this sense that something is just a little off. It's more difficult when you know you don't quite belong, isn't it? Even when you're in a place where you share a language, like in the United Kingdom, people hold their silverware differently. They line up differently. They ask questions differently. There are just some subtle differences. And one of the things I realized is when you're traveling like that, it's wonderful to experience these things. It's great to see how these differences in the world make a difference in how we live, and to see different people's customs and to experience it firsthand. But here's the thing. Every time we came home, I always had this sense that once I got home, I could breathe a little easier because everything was easier. When you go to the store, you know exactly what to do. If you go to the drugstore, you know what to buy and where to get it. When you're on the phone asking for help, you know what questions to ask. And when you're outside of your environment, when you're outside of the place that you're from, it can be hard to do that. Everything's just a little bit amiss. So one of the things I realized this summer from these travels is I really am an American. No matter how hard I try, no matter where I go, I will always be an American. And that's a good thing because it's who I am. One of the things that I also have been thinking about a lot is this sense of identity and the things that make us who we are and what we are. We all have these things that give us a sense of identity, and having a sense of identity is a good and a positive thing. But there are occasions and there are ways where there's a dark side to identity. There's a dark side to identity when it becomes a form of tribalism, where we see our identity as something that has an impermeable barrier around it and only people like us can get in, and it's a closed system. Because when we come up with a closed system like this, what happens is we see ourselves as not only separate from the world around us, but we see ourselves as better than those who are not part of our tribe or of our group. And it causes division, but it also is a source of judgment. One of the things I've also thought a lot about, and you'll hear about all the time, is you'll hear about people talking about building a Christian identity. And I think we need a Christian identity because we need to know who we are and whose we are. But if you think that having a Christian identity somehow will inoculate you against this sort of tribalism, then you're not paying attention to the world around you. And you haven't looked very deeply into your own heart. Because Christians, as much as anybody, can see the Christian faith as a tribe of people with an impermeable barrier for those who don't meet our standard, with a door that seems perpetually closed to certain types of people. And worst of all, it seems sometimes that people see our Christian identity as an opportunity for us to judge the world and the people around us and see how they don't measure up to who we are and what we expect. This morning, I want us to think more deeply about what it means to have a truly Christian identity and what that means for our place in the world and in our communities. What does it mean for those of us who bear the name of Jesus? to be people who have this deep sense of who we are and a deep sense that we belong to God, but yet don't develop this tribal sense that we're somehow better and stand in judgment of our neighbors in the world. I think the only way to come to that kind of an understanding of identity is for us to look more deeply into what scriptures say. And the two scriptures that we read this morning both speak of our identity as Christian people. The first one in Psalm 100 starts like this. It says, "Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come into his presence with singing." This psalm was written many, many centuries ago by people who were thinking of worship songs that they would sing as they went into the temple for worship. But I want you to notice something in the very first verse that might not stand out to you at first. When it says, "Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth." Do you notice who's invited to make a joyful noise to the Lord? Everybody and everything. All the earth, all creation is invited to sing praise to the Lord of heaven and earth. Everyone is invited to be part of this chorus of praise to the Lord. What an incredible statement about the breadth of God's love for the world, that everyone is invited to be part of this chorus of praise. I actually think that this psalm was one way for the psalmist to kind of break through that sense of tribalism that people had, that only God's chosen, only those who already believed in him are the ones who could sing God's praise. But the scriptures tell us that's not it. All creation, all the earth, sing God's praise. Everyone is invited. And then it goes on, it says, "Worship the Lord with gladness, enter into his presence with singing." Everyone is invited to enter into his presence with singing and with praise. And then the psalm goes on, and it moves from this sense of everyone being invited, it moves on to a second piece of this identity, which is this: know that the Lord is God. It is he that made us, and we are his people and the sheep of his pasture. So the first part is that the community that God calls is much wider than we could imagine. The second part is this: it all starts with an understanding of who God is. Then it moves to what we do. Know that the Lord is God. It is he that made us, and we are his. It's this beautiful, this intimate image of the Lord who created us and who loves us, and that we call on his name, we know that we belong to him. So it starts with the breadth of God's call, and then it narrows down to God's call to you. And God's call to you is this: I created you, I love you, and you are mine. And it has this warm image where it says, we are his people and the sheep of his pasture. That we are under the loving care of God. That he watches over us. He protects us. He tends to our needs. He takes us to places where we can and will be fed. It's this beautiful image of who the Lord is and who we are in his eyes and what our lives look like as a result of following him. And then at the end of this psalm it says, for the Lord is good. His steadfast love endures forever, and his faithfulness to all generations. The second part, talking about God, tells us that we belong to God, but this part tells us that we also belong to one another. His goodness is from generation to generation. That being a follower of Jesus and living the Christian life is not the life of a lone ranger. It's not the life of somebody who gets to, look at everyone else and think they don't measure up. Instead, it's a life of commitment to one another, knowing that we belong not only to God, but we belong to God generation to generation, and therefore we belong to one another, that we are truly brothers and sisters brought together by our knowledge that we all belong to God, those who call on his name. You know, this morning at the first service, we had a baptism of a 1-year-old boy. And we had a children's message where we all gathered around the baptismal font, and we talked about what this means. What it means is that God claims us, and God seals us, and God calls us his own. And that we become brothers and sisters by the grace and the power of God at work in us and through us. And that invitation is open to everyone. But as you know, when we baptize, we ask questions of the parents, but we also ask questions of the congregation. We remind people that being faithful to that child means being faithful to the promises that we've made, that we'll be Sunday school teachers and youth group leaders, and we'll walk alongside the parents, and we'll pray with them, and we'll pray for them along the way, because we belong to one another in Jesus Christ. And it's not some closed circle, it's some ever-broadening circle. That our lives will be shaped by what I will call the overflow. One time I was with a friend, and we were in a pretty stressful situation, and we were tired, and it was one of those moments where there's a great opportunity to not be your best self. And this friend of mine just handled it with such grace. I said, how on earth did you do that? Because that wasn't my first reaction. And what he said was, I make it a habit each day to wake up and to give thanks to God for all that he's done and for who he is and what he's done in my life. And to remember how good God has been to me. He says, that's an important place for me to start every day. He says, because I know I'm going to run into these moments in time where I'm frustrated, where I'm angry, where things haven't gone well. And he says, and I always think maybe by being thankful and remembering that God will use that and fill me up so the overflow takes over when I can't be who I want to be in the moment. But the overflow of God's grace that's been poured out and into me is poured out from me even in difficult moments. To me, that's such a beautiful way to think about living the Christian life. There's this overflow that comes from knowing the grace and the mercy of God. And that overflow is an overflow of invitation and of love and compassion for those who are around us. Our passage from 1 Peter also speaks about this sense of identity and this sense of belonging. It speaks about it a little differently. Just to kind of set up 1 Peter was written to these church communities that were very new communities, and they were in what in the biblical times they called Asia Minor. In our language, we would call it Western Turkey. So there's these series of churches there, and we know that these churches were mainly populated by Gentile Christians. And these Gentile Christians were always kind of in conflict with Jewish Christians because they were trying to work out how do they live out their faith without taking on all the Jewish laws and practices. And the second question was, what does it mean to be called the people of God when you don't have this great history of being the people of God, but you're kind of a Johnny-come-lately? And of course, we know from the New Testament, the Apostle Paul tells us that Gentiles are like a branch that's been grafted onto the tree. And in 1 Peter, he makes this remarkable claim about God's people. Here's what he says. You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people. Now, if he were to stop just there, that sounds a lot like some of that tribal language, doesn't it? We're a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people. It sounds like we are a people who are set apart, and if we just stop there, I know what human nature is like. We would use that as a position to judge the world rather than as a position to love and invite the world to know Jesus and his love. But Peter goes on, and here's what he says. In order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. So God has made people who were no people into his people. A chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people. But he's done it for a purpose, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. To call ourselves followers of Jesus to claim that we are part of the people of God. If you see yourself as part of this royal priesthood, this chosen race, the scripture tells us that that is not something by which we should build a tribe or close the door, but instead is an identity that we have been given so that we might proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. What that means is that we have been called, we've been given this Christian identity as those who belong to God, so that we can share this love and this grace and this mercy that we have been given and to give it away. That's the reason that we are given a Christian identity, so that we can give away this grace and this mercy that we've been given, because it never runs out. But by giving it away, it expands and it grows. Later in the passage, Peter also says that we are like aliens or refugees in the world. What that means is sometimes when we have this Christian identity, we'll be like travelers who are somewhere else in the world, where some of our customs won't quite seem to fit. Some of the ways that we live won't make complete sense with the world around us. Sometimes it will look out of step, out of tune, and even radical, because following Jesus is different than following the ways of this world. But this is the life that God calls us to. This is what it means to have a Christian identity, that we are strangers and aliens in this world, because God has called us. God has called us to live this way. So at this point, you may be asking yourself, okay, that's great, but what does that look like for me, my day-to-day life? So this week, I was actually reading Time magazine on the Stairmaster at the gym, and it's from last week, and there's this article in there about Jimmy Carter, former President Carter. And you know, he's 90-some years old, and he and his wife Rosalind still go every year to a Habitat for Humanity build, and they work on houses, building houses for people who need them. And there was this little article on him, and it starts out, and it goes like, there's this one section where he'd gone to South Bend, just outside South Bend, Indiana, at the request of a friend to work on a blitz. And they write this. They say, it's a bright, crisp morning in this suburb of South Bend, where a formerly vacant lot is being transformed into 23 vinyl-sided houses. The one the Carters are working on will soon belong to Cleora Taylor, a 36-year-old single mother of 4 who will pay it off with a no-interest mortgage. We happen to be Christians, and this gives us a chance to put our religious beliefs into practical projects, Carter says in his soft country drawl. It's a very difficult thing for wealthy people to do, like we are, to cross the great barrier between us and people who have never had a decent place to live. People ask me what I want to be remembered for. And I generally say peace and human rights, he says. I think it's a basic right of a human being to have a home that's decent in which to raise children, and to have an adequate amount of health care, an adequate amount of education to take advantage of whatever talent God may have given them. It's a simple creed. But when put into practice with this level of dedication, it can seem like a radical one. So what does it look like to live as someone with a Christian identity? It means finding ourselves in the ordinary places of life and living in a way that bears witness to the love of God for the world. I actually think of another case where I saw this with great clarity. Brian's in the back, and it's actually about Brian. You know, this is Brian's last Sunday here. And it was a couple years ago, Brian did this Christmas concert at the Tin Angel. And he told me he was going, and we got tickets, and we went with some other people. And so we go into the show, and if you've never been to the Tin Angel, it's essentially a bar, which is fine. And the crowd there, like, you know, no judgment, but my guess is most of them weren't going to church the next morning. Many of them couldn't get up to go to church the next morning, I think. But we go and Brian's up there with this other person, they're singing these Christmas songs, and here's this environment that just seems completely secular because it is, and Brian's singing these Christmas songs, and in between the Christmas songs, he invited everyone to come to church. He talked about the songs we were singing and said, we think of these as festive holiday songs, but they're more than that. They're singing about God's love for the world and his son that he sent for us. But here's kind of the amazing thing about it. Like as he was talking in this place where in a normal context it would seem almost like it was out of place, but there it just seemed to work and it seemed to fit because it was so natural. In a lot of ways, I think it was really just the overflow of someone who knows that he's loved and created by God and therefore wants to tell people about the love that he has experienced in Jesus Christ. The reality is that for us to live as Christian people with this Christian identity where this love overflows, in many cases is not as difficult as we might think. For you, it might start with something as simple as making a decision. That when you're angry or annoyed or frustrated and you're in front of someone who's done that to you, you can just make a decision. I'm going to take 3 seconds before I respond. And I'm going to say, take a deep breath. And I'm just going to not say the first thing that comes to my mind because I want God to use this. Or maybe, like Jimmy Carter, you believe that one of the basic human rights that people have is an education so they can use whatever gifts God has given them. If you look in your bulletin, you will find out that there's an informational meeting coming up about a tutoring program right across the street from our church at the Township Building that happens every week throughout the school year. And they're looking for people to sit down with students from Ambler to do homework help and to tutor and to guide students so they can get the basic education that they deserve so they can live into all that God intends for them to be. Maybe that's a way that you can think about living out your faith and being the person that God has called you to be. For some of you, it means volunteering as a Sunday school teacher, or with our youth program, or working with Prime Time on one Tuesday a month. For some of us, it means giving generously to the work that God is doing here and other places. For some of us, it means perhaps visiting the sick, praying with and for our neighbors, finding people who seem lonely or friendless and reaching out. Maybe it means simply being compassionate to the people you work with when they tell you about their day and putting down the things that you're doing and listening to them and praying for them. The ways that we do this are endless. But the scriptures tell us that in Jesus Christ we have been given this identity, that we are people who belong to him, that you are a royal priesthood, a holy people, God's own people. But God has made us into this not so that we can judge the world, but so that we can love the world that he loves too. That we can offer forgiveness and mercy and grace and love in his name. So the people will know the light that was shined on us and know that they can have it shine on them too. And they too can know this love and mercy and grace, so that our neighbors who don't know might become part of this royal priesthood, this people of God. Let us pray.